This lecture is prepared for Indigenous Studies 201, Intro to Indigenous Studies with Dr. Adela Kincaid. Fiskarma hula dunya, is misha an de vetach agus is misha not da galich, yenaf na hevena. Hama hunshara na ve hen gare, Luchland, alabasasin agus edin, ach chamia firach angos a chaligari. Hey everyone, my name is Andy Airy and I'm a graduate student at the University of Calgary in the Department of Political Science, currently writing my thesis on the politics of land and land-human relations. I came through the Indigenous Studies program, actually, for my undergrad. My bachelor was a double major in International Indigenous Studies and Global Development Studies, so I took this class in my very first semester at UCalgary, Indigenous Studies 201, and it shaped the path that I'm on today. In this lecture, we'll be looking at land-based learning as a theory and practice, the role of Indigenous science, and then more deeply at what it is to build relationship with the land from our various positionalities and perspectives. I'm going to begin by telling you a bit about my work outside of the university. I have a project research and facilitation position with the Resilience Institute, a nonprofit org that partners with primarily Indigenous nations across Canada and worldwide on grant-funded initiatives toward cultural and ecological resiliency. So right now I'm working on a few projects with different nations in Alberta, but I was recently down on the Blackfoot Piikani Reserve helping facilitate a bison harvest workshop. And the workshop was part of a larger biomonitoring project within Piikani, where the Resilience Institute has connected the nation with scientists from various universities, including the U of C, and community-based monitoring experts from Environment Canada and beyond, so that the nation can build their own monitoring program for the land and for the bison going forward. So this is not interventionist Western scientists going in and telling the nation what and how to do, as has been done under the guise of development in the past, but instead responding to Piikani's self-determined request to help them build local capacities for managing their data and their futures. One of the priorities for Piikani is the health of their bison. Bison, as you may have heard it said, are a keystone species, and this can be understood in a holistic sense that is cultural and spiritual as well as environmental. Buffalo consciousness forms a significant underpinning of Blackfoot societies and for many prairie nations. In Cree scholar and writer Tasha Hubbard's film Singing Back the Buffalo, she describes the bison as the balance in relational networks. As migratory animals, bison disperse seeds through dung and via those that cling onto their fur over huge distances. When they graze, special enzymes in their saliva encourage plant life to grow robustly, increasing their ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Bison's uniquely shaped hooves aerate the soil as they move, increasing oxygen and nutrient penetration, and the depressions made by their wallowing, their rolling on the ground to coat themselves in dust to ward off insects, become storage for overland drinking water, and they create micro-ecosystems for prairie salamanders, frogs, new plant species, and more. From an Indigenous perspective, bison are stewards of the health of the entire ecosystem, and in this way, as Tasha Hubbard says, bison offer a guide to living well. More and more, ecologists and adaptation specialists are recognizing the long-standing Indigenous knowledge of bison is key to climate adaptation and resilience, and there are growing initiatives from Canada down through Mexico in reinstating them substantively on the land. So then why, if Indigenous peoples have always known these things, is Piikani partnering with Western/global scientists in creating their monitoring program? A significant aspect of the bison workshop was gathering monitoring samples from the bison, fur, kidney, liver, muscle, blood, and feces, and bringing those samples into the high school, where biologists from U Ottawa worked with the youth and taught them how to prepare the samples for laboratory analysis. The why of bringing in Western science comes down to a few things. One, this idea of two-eyed seeing, where the strengths of Indigenous knowledge are complemented by the strengths of Western knowledge, and vice versa. And two, the importance of intergenerational knowledge, bringing the youth into the traditional as well as the Western scientific processes of monitoring, so that in the future, they can leverage the language and strengths of the dominant system to make space for their own ways of being, doing, and knowing. And here I want to bring in the concept of Indigenous science. Many people hold the misconception that Indigenous knowledge is the opposite of Western science, or what Indigenous mathematician Corey Chewy calls big S science, when in fact the underlying principles of big S science are ingrained in every part of traditional indigenous existence. In Piikani, when Elder Jay harvested the bison by removing its innards, stripping a hide, quartering the meat, etc., he said, "This is a good bison." A canonically elder phrase, but encoded within it was a deep level of qualitative analysis. Inches of fat, growth of undercoat, muscle density, the texture of the lungs, a plump crimson liver free of white spots. Indigenous science, just like Western science, evaluates phenomena that have been empirically observed over time and have demonstrated replicable patterns of cause and effect. Between oral traditions and written ones, such as the Winter Count, a pictographic record of environmental and human events traditionally inscribed on elk or bison hide, Indigenous science operationalizes qualitative data collected over centuries, even millennia. The Winter Count is a central framework to the monitoring work going on in Piikani, as elsewhere, reflecting on how their ancestors recognized and adapted to climatic change. The Piikani Nation are constructing their climate adaptation plans for the future. The Winter Count is evidence that they have always been resilient. This being said, one of the fundamental differences with Indigenous science is that it includes the experiential body of the observer. Unlike in Western science, where the human observer is mechanistically eliminated from the scientific process, insofar as that's actually possible, Indigenous science recognizes that humans are embedded within it, as equally participatory strands along the web of relational cause and effect. Chief Richard Atleo of the Nunchalna on Vancouver Island describes Indigenous science as sawak, or oneness, an assumption of the all-inclusiveness of existence and experience in a universe that is simply a network of relationships. Corey Chewy has taught me that Indigenous science is not separate from the holistic of Indigenous ways of knowing, which includes the spiritual, the cultural, the political, social, etc. Both Indigenous knowing and Indigenous science are a way of living, of seeing, understanding, and moving through the physical world, as well as in partnership with it. Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Bidasmosek-Simpson talks about how there is no set curriculum in traditional Indigenous pedagogies, because it's absurd to expect everyone to master the same body of formal information. Knowledge comes to and through us all differently, and an abundant realization of a whole community's gifts requires diversity in function and understanding. Thinking on these gifts, I want to circle back to Elder Jay and the bison one last time. So we talked about how there was a practiced and replicable method of qualitative analysis that allowed Elder Jay to say, "This bison is good." But in reality, that was only half of his process. The other half is something that we can call relational consciousness, which is an intuitive ability one develops through relationship with the more than human world. Intuition, or transrational intuition, refers to the knowledge we gain without knowing exactly how we came to know it. Animism, which is a Western anthropological concept that came through the study of European paganism, but does a decent job capturing the relational ontology of many Indigenous cultures, refers to the extension of beingness and agency beyond exclusivity to humans to all the entities of the natural world. Marry the two, and that's essentially relational consciousness. All is inspirited, all is alive, and we are all in relation with each other. Most of us can fairly easily see this kind of knowing playing out in our relationships with our pets. If I told you that last night, because I didn't share my popcorn with my dog, his feelings were hurt, on the whole you'd probably believe me. After all, he's my dog, he's been with me for years, and it's not that hard to accept that I probably know him well enough to make such an assertion, regardless of his inability to communicate in explicit language. For one, I've observed his behavior over enough time to recognize his patterns, but also, our relational knowledge of each other is an exchange that travels both ways. It's pretty well accepted that our pets know us just as well as we know them. In Indigenous and in decolonizing pedagogies, this kind of extended kin, or kin-centric relationality, is foundational to learning, growing, and healing as an entire community. But consider how you might react hearing someone talk about having that kind of close, kin-centric relationship with a mountain, or a forest, or a particular tree. I have gotten some looks when I tell people that the Elbow River actively helps me with my research. In our society, which is to say the dominant society, the acceptance of relational intuition rarely translates to the land, or even to species of animal that exist outside of human domestication. Eurocentric traditions of knowledge confine all instances of intuition to the workings of a brilliant human mind. Indigenous and animistic understandings, however, recognize that some forms of knowing grow from a mutual intuitive consciousness and are available to all, regardless of racial or cultural background. For some, they may just be what Barrett and Wutherick call a forgotten form of knowing. In his award-winning book, The Spell of the Sensuous, American ecologist and philosopher David Abram takes us along his journey of reclaiming lost connection with the more than just human world. Through his learning with indigenous communities in rural Asia, Abram discovered he didn't need to be a shaman to converse with non-human beings and places. By dismantling his own reductionist and anthropocentric mindset, he found himself remembering, reorienting himself to his inherent place within a more than human matrix of sensations and sensibilities. This kind of decolonial relationality simply requires paying thoughtful and rigorous attention to the natural world, of which our own being-sensing bodies are a part. We are all ecological. Perhaps some of the internal work of decolonization is choosing once again to believe it. Métis scholar Craig Ginn reminds us that the very concept of being represents a long-standing endeavor that spans history, geography, worldview, and even species. Together, humans along with the natural world are, and always have been, in a profound and endless project of meaning-making. How we as humans value the more than human contributions to our knowledge is what makes the difference. Let's look at an example of this within an indigenous science context. Sweetgrass is one of the plants that has long held a seat in the ceremonial circles of prairie indigenous nations. Western science has identified sweetgrass as one of the key actors in prairie carbon sequestration, with its large networks of rhizomes and deep root systems. Huge federal grants now facilitate sweetgrass rewilding initiatives in places like Piikani and across Canada and the United States. Sweetgrass creates habitat for critical prairie species like bison, but also coyotes, hawks, owls, rodents, and it supports the health and biodiversity of the entire grassland ecosystem. Sweetgrass is amazing. We know, say Indigenous peoples. This we've always known. The answer to how they know, however, like so much of what we've discussed about land relationality, doesn't fit comfortably within Western knowledge boundaries. It's a little bit phenomenological, a little bit quantum, a little biological. The answer being, because the sweetgrass told us so. Sioux author Deloria Jr. discusses how the method of relational consciousness was verified within Indigenous societies by testing in daily life, saying, if a plant told them how to harvest it and prepare it for food or use as medicine, they followed the plant's directions, and they always found the message to be true. Indigenous scientist Gregory Cajete describes this process as predicated by understanding a plant's essence through intuition, feeling, and relationship. Plants like sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco, which became spiritual partners, established themselves via personal and communal covenants with First Peoples. A covenant, like a treaty, is a sacred agreement between parties. The covenant of tobacco stipulates its reciprocal offering for whatever is asked or taken from the land. Sweetgrass plays its own roles in ceremony and community, and unlike many plants, thrives the more it interacts with humans. In her book Braiding Sweetgrass, Potawatomi Anishinaabe author and plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer describes the work of one of her graduate students. Wishing to examine the partnership between Indigenous communities and sweetgrass, the student examined sweetgrass populations around Indigenous settlements where there was a great deal of human harvesting, as well as populations which were left mostly undisturbed, and compared their changes over time. The experimental data revealed that the human disturbed sweetgrass populations grew faster, healthier, and more numerous via the phenomenon of compensatory growth, while the relegated populations stagnated or even decreased. Thus, the student was able to quantifiably demonstrate the mutual benefit of the community's long-standing relationship with sweetgrass. Kimmerer extends this relational nature of plants to the concept of land as a gift economy, where the gifts of land, like berries, sweetgrass, breathable air, and drinkable water, are offered to us through no merit of our own, and regardless of settler or indigenous status. Without even having to ask, they are freely gifted to all. She talks about how wild strawberries, the gift of wild growing strawberries, shaped her worldview and the way she came to understand herself growing up. Reading this in her work, I suddenly vividly recalled the exact moment in my childhood where I first experienced the gift economy. I was at a campsite in Oregon, and I think I was 9 years old. My uncle was cooking a Pacific salmon that we'd caught just that afternoon over the barbecue while I stuffed my hands with berries. These fat, sweet, seemingly endless blackberries from the bramble bushes nearby. And I remember the feeling of plenty. And how lucky am I? It was this feeling of being deeply and wholeheartedly provided for. I'm certain that we have all had some kind of experience like this, and I really encourage everyone to reflect on it. Coming to appreciate the significance of my experience through Kimmerer's work, I actually ended up tattooing those blackberries on my body as a sort of ritual, recognizing and in gratitude for that gift. But gratitude alone, says Kimmerer, is insufficient to sustain the gift economy. She writes, when berries spread out their giveaway blanket, offering their sweetness to birds and bears and boys alike, the transaction does not end there. Something beyond gratitude is asked of us. The berries trust that we will uphold our end of the bargain and disperse their seeds to new places to grow, which is good for berries and for boys. They remind us that all flourishing is mutual. We need the berries and the berries need us. Their gifts multiply by our care for them and dwindle from our neglect. We are bound in a covenant of reciprocity, a pact of mutual responsibility to sustain those who sustain us. And so the empty bowl is filled. A relationship with land employs the same principles as relationships between humans. Recognizing the other party as an inherently equal actor with equal agency in determining the shape and nature of that relationship. Recognizing that all relationships require quality time and sincerity and a real effort to grow our understanding of one another. And they require care, as Kimmerer describes. Require us acting and advocating to sustain those that sustain us. Both Kimmerer and Simpson call up the story of Nanabuja when discussing how one learns from the land, particularly when in new places. Simpson writes that first human Nanabuja did not know his parentage or his origins, only that he was set down into a fully peopled world of plants and animals, winds and water. He was an immigrant too. Before he arrived, the world was all here, in balance and in harmony, each one fulfilling their purpose in the creation. He understood, as some did not, that this was not the new world, but one that was ancient before he came. With all the power and all the failings of a human being, Nanabuja did his best with the original instructions and tried to become native to his new home. I tend to think of this like being in someone else's house. There's a tacit recognition that they know their home best, what it needs and how it should be navigated. I can let myself feel at home there, and if I spend enough time, I'm sure that I will become very at home. But regardless of how comfortable I get, at no point am I going to rearrange their spoons. The order of spoons, like the protocols and values of natural law, are best established by those who know that place the most. When in Treaty 7, I bring tobacco. When I was in Hokkaido learning with the Ainu, Taichi-san taught us to offer sake. We make new relationships with place as informed by the deep relational networks already established by the peoples there. This is the process of becoming, as said by Kimmerer, naturalized to place. Ever since I can remember, I was drawn to rivers. I saw and understood myself differently when in the water, felt myself as something more than just one body, but as hundreds of bodies in hundreds of rivers. Some years ago, I went on a learning journey to try and understand my place on this land. If being born Canadian didn't make me belong to this land, nor to these rivers, and if Timbits and Monday night hockey weren't my culture, then who was I, here or anywhere? I discovered my Gaelic and Nordic roots, my maternal clan Anderson from the Scottish Highlands, and my paternal name Eri from the Old Norse Era, a habitational name given to those who dwelled on rivers. In my ancestral traditions, rivers and bodies of water were places of intersection between the human and spirit worlds, places of great reverence, respect, and connection. Big aha moment. No wonder I couldn't seem to stay out of the Elbow River. Where I had come from became my first firm foothold toward understanding my connection to here. In fall 2024, while grading land-based learning reflections by students of Indigenous Studies 201, I noticed a similar connection to rivers from all the students who mentioned Punjabi heritage. I later learned that Punjab is the land of 5 rivers, and that these rivers make up a key element of Punjabi's spiritual and place-based identity. I was fascinated how, like me, they were drawn to a similar connection with the rivers here. Now, this is not to suggest that our ancestry is the only reason we feel drawn to certain places or land entities. Knowing where we come from is critical to understanding our positionality on this land and where we sit within the structural nexus of power and privilege, but blood is not a determinant. Aymara scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, when reflecting on her Indigenous and European roots, says that identity is something we construct while living in the present. Where ancestral connection is valuable is in its ability to be a touchstone, helping us to recognize what about how we connect with land, with ourselves, or with the world around us feels the most resonant, authentic, or true. Louisiana Creole scholar Rain Prudhomme Cranford calls this process echolocative, self-reflexive rhetorical praxis, a call and response dialectic of identity that takes shape in the rich informational spaces between self and land and time. In other words, by honoring our pasts and intuitions, as well as the places on which we now stand, we call ourselves, our stories, our inherent knowing, and our connectedness beyond the separations of the modern age back into being, back into wholeness. Being Canadian means different things to different people. Some better, some worse, but it also universally locates us within an ongoing contestation of land, identity, and belonging. Tuck and Yang importantly say that to be a settler is to be unsettled. Intersections of race, ethnicity, and religion complicate our experiences on Indigenous land, and immigrants and Indigenous peoples alike are failed by the watery politics of multiculturalism. Even with all the richness and intimacy of connecting with land, we cannot ignore that land is at times a site of grief, of anger and sorrow for what we've lost, places and identities left behind, stolen cultures and languages and kin. Coming onto the land means coming more deeply into ourselves and embodying those contested spaces in which we now stand. There can be loneliness, uncertainty, alienation. How can we ever feel at home away from the home of what was? There isn't one sufficient answer, or if there is, I sure don't have it. The nature of the settler state requires constantly titrating between multiple conflicting realities and states of identity, probably for the rest of our lives. Author and playwright Carolyn Dunn, when writing on her Louisiana Creole heritage, says this: I want to tell a story of a family's migration from the old country to a new country, a new place, a new name, new tongue. A place that siblings brought with them to a new space, adding their story to the space that already existed, their voices to the voices already there. These brothers and sisters took with them their home and remade it anew, leaving behind their language and planting seeds that would grow and come back. For me, home is when I'm with the river. Capital I Indigenous is a birthright word, says Kimmerer. No amount of time or caring changes history or substitutes for soul-deep fusion with the land. But remember that every one of you, deep as marrow, knows that feeling of fusion. Whether it's to the lands here or someplace else, somewhere ancient, we all know how to know and love a place. The trick, as said by Daniel Voth, is how not to be an asshole in someone else's territory. So let's be like Nanabuj. Learn the instructions of the land as taught to its first beings, and make relationships with humans and non-humans based in accountability, reciprocity, and community. Let's find our place within the gift economy of the natural world. With our actions, our talents, our words, and our ways of knowing, gift back as much as we've been given, or more. Let's be good guests, thoughtful and careful newcomers rather than incomers. For all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, reclaiming land relationality is not about retreating to the past, but about moving into the future with all our relational gifts and strengths. We all have a right and a responsibility to good relations with the land. Aspira da natire, tapad lev eth shona viakamancho. Omachige.